Hello, I'm Dr. Ann Ramsey. In considering the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the 1900s, the event that most stands out, of course, is World War I, not to mention the Spanish flu. And the world lost 20 million and 50 million lives, respectively. And on the heels of such tremendous loss, the close of the war in 1918 brought with it great relief. And there was no better place to understand that than in the United States, where there was this sort of sense of euphoria. We were in a post-war economic boom, and we were celebrating getting rid of the old values, the old Victorian values, and embracing things like the Jazz Age and the Harlem Renaissance, and hence it was called the Roaring Twenties. It was a time that celebrated very much being alive. And we can see that when we look at the numbers between 1910 and 1920. According to the US Census, for example, at 1910, prior to World War I, most Americans still lived in rural communities, but by 1920, they had moved into those urban sectors so that there was an even number of people living in urban centers and rural communities. In 1910 to 1920, we see almost a doubled increase of high school graduates and of passenger vehicles on the road. In 1910 and to 1920, we see an increase of 15-fold. They were manufacturing cars that people could afford and people were buying them. But what's less well known about this era is it's an era of incredible scientific investment. So let me explain. The first industrialized war in the history of the world was the American Civil War, and it was fought with bullets and trains. About 50 years later, we go into World War I. World War I is fought with nitrate explosions, tanks, planes, and of course, submarines. It was a very different type of war. And what came out of that was an understanding of the need economically to invest and to continue to invest in the scientific and technological advancements that were coming out of laboratories. Many brilliant minds contributed to the efforts of World War I, and they took their talents and their inventions into the war. Thinkers like Henry Moseley, Edwin Hubble, and of course Marie Curie, and not all of them came back, but their work and their inventions would stay with us. And thus by 1920, 2 years after the end of World War I, American scientists were left with carrying on the responsibility of advancing the sciences. You see, the war had left Europe largely in ruin. Laboratories were gone, equipment was gone, and the resources were tied up in trying to rebuild infrastructure, not to mention the lives that were lost. And so all eyes turned this direction. And this includes astronomy. Astronomers in the United States after the war had an almost unprecedented influence on the international astronomical community because the wartime losses in Europe had been so significant. And this is where our story goes to a Delaware native, the woman named Annie Jump Cannon. Having been raised by a family that supported her education, she, of course, was on her way back to school before the start of World War I to work on graduate work at Wellesley College and to bifurcate her time and do some work at Harvard. She quickly became interested in her studies of astronomy, mathematics, and physics, and extending her research on the project the Harvard Observatory was working on under the direction of Edward Pickering that was called the Stellar Spectra Project. She participated while she was there in the first ever experiments with X-rays in the history of the country, and she published her first entire catalog of stars by the time by 1901. She developed a new way to classify stars that today is called the Harvard Spectral Classification System. And in 1911, she became the curator of the observational photographs at Harvard's observatory, a very prestigious position because she was incredibly fast and incredibly accurate. From 1911 to 1915, she cataloged 5,000 stars per month. She was incredibly successful, and by 1921, she was the first woman to receive a doctorate of astronomy from Groningen University. Then a year later, the International Astronomical Union adopted her method as the official spectral classification system for all scientists internationally. She made more than 300 variable star discoveries. She discovered a double star and 5 nova discoveries. She created a bibliography card index of more than 400,000 stars, and her index is still used today at Harvard. During her lifetime, she belonged to the National Women's Party. She advocated for suffrage. And of course, in 1923, she was voted one of the 12 most important living women in the United States by the National League of Women Voters. She went on to become the first woman to be awarded the Henry Draper Medal of Honor from the National Academy of Sciences. And it was only then, after these many decades of success, that she was finally offered a permanent teaching position at Harvard in 1938, where she continued to work for 2 more years till she retired, and then she stayed on working and researching there until her death in 1941. In her lifetime, she received many accolades and honorary degrees and was a member of numerous scientific societies. At a time when only 20% of women worked in the United States outside of the home, Cannon was employed 6 days a week, countless hours. There wasn't a set work week yet. And she earned 25 cents an hour when she first started, which was less than the secretaries at Harvard. And it was less than men in factories who at the time were earning about 40 cents an hour. Though Cannon and her contemporaries ushered in suffrage and expanded rights for women, they still earned substantially less than their male counterparts. Few colleges admitted women, even though we started to see more women stay in school and enter higher education, and even fewer would award graduate degrees. 2/3 of women over the age of 14 were married, and Cannon never married and never had children, instead devoting her life to her work. As the author Jenny Woodham explains, by discovering new stars, nebula, and nova, and going on in her career to shape the then emerging field of astrophysics with her special analysis of stars, this Harvard computer gained recognition around the world over the decades for her contributions to astronomy. What made her work possible is the political and economic shifts in policy of post-World War I United States. Patents were made easier to obtain, more government and private funding became available for research and development, corporate inventions became more lucrative, fueling even more R&D, and the demands of industrial war continued to fuel an ongoing scientific and technological demand for that kind of research. Like Westgate points out, thriving markets require a secure political foundation, and a post-war economy fueled by the profits of a free market system demonstrated this, even in the sciences.